Monstera, we love them for those big mature leaves that have lots of fenestrations in it, which are the splits in the leaves, and the perforations in the leaves, which are those holes in the leaves. Today, I'm going to share with you 5 tips on how to grow your Monstera as fast as possible to get those big mature leaves with lots of fenestrations and perforations in it. And watch the video until the end where I share with you a bonus tip as well. Lighting is one of the most important aspects of growing a Monstera. If I place my Monstera in a dark, dingy corner of the room, it's not going to do well. There's just not enough light for the Monstera. And if I do the opposite and place it in an area where it's receiving direct afternoon sunlight, it's probably not going to do well there either, because the direct afternoon sunlight tends to be a lot more harsh, a lot more intense, and can burn the leaves. Monsteras, they live in the tropical rainforest underneath the canopy, and they receive a lot of bright indirect sunlight, and that's what they enjoy. Lots of bright indirect sunlight. Now, if you have a household like mine where there's literally no space left to actually move the plants, and you can only place it in the dark corner of the room, I suggest you use a grow light to actually supplement the lighting, and this will allow the plant to capture more light through photosynthesis and actually produce energy for the plant. And if you can only place the Monstera in direct afternoon sunlight, I suggest you acclimate the plant. So what I mean by acclimation is that you don't want to go from low light and directly to afternoon direct sunlight, because the plant's not going to have enough time for the leaves to adapt to the higher intense light, and it can lead to a lot of burning of the leaves. So what I suggest you do is move it from a darker area to an area where it's receiving bright indirect sunlight all day long. And then the next month, move it to the area where it's receiving direct morning sunlight and bright indirect afternoon sunlight. And then the following month, move it to the area where it's receiving direct afternoon sunlight. This will just help to minimize the chances of the leaves burning. Now, putting your Monstera still in direct sunlight, even with the acclimation, it can still burn the leaves. So maybe if you can place plants in front of the Monstera, that will help as well. The other tip I have is that when you're repotting a Monstera, if a Monstera, they have these very thick, like udon noodle looking shaped roots, and it's very strong. If we're putting a Monstera into a pot that's too big, what's going to happen is that the Monstera is actually going to end up in a panic, and it's actually going to prioritize in producing those udon shaped roots compared to producing the leaves. And in this case, if we want a lot of mature leaves, then we want the plant to actually prioritize in producing leaves rather than roots. So only repot the Monstera if it's required, and if you do need to repot it, go 1 pot size up, maximum 2 size up, because going more than that, the plant is just going to produce more and more roots, and it's actually going to slow down the production of producing more of those big mature leaves with those fenestrations on it. The next tip I have is that Monsteras are climbers. They have these aerial roots, which are roots that grow on the stem, and these roots, they act like kind of like little claws. In the tropical rainforest, they use these aerial roots to attach to the surrounding trees and climb upwards so that it can gain more access to sunlight. They actually also use these aerial roots to drop down to the ground below and use it so that the plant can produce, well, actually absorb more water and nutrients from the ground. And we want to simulate this, because by simulating its natural habitat and growth habit, the leaves are going to get bigger, and if the leaves are getting bigger, what happens is that the Monstera will produce more of those fenestrations and perforations in it. So you can simulate it in the home by using things like a plank of wood or a coca-cola pole or even a moss pole there. My preference is actually to use a moss pole. The reason for that is the moss pole, if I put moss in it, it's like an extension of the soil. So I don't need the actual Monstera to be in such a big pot, so it saves the room, some room in the household, because the pot doesn't need to be as big. Also, it's an extension of the soil, so the actual plant can actually, the air roots of the plant can actually grow in the moss pole for it to gain more nutrients and also gain more water as well. Now, using a moss pole doesn't necessarily mean you actually have to put moss in it. You don't actually need to put moss. You can put substitute things like, you can actually also put soil in it. You can also put things like perlite in it, just a substitute, but you don't actually need to use moss. So if you don't have moss, just put some soil in it instead. The next tip I have is that Monsteras, they do like pruning, but if it's pruned too much, what's going to happen is that the Monstera is actually, the leaves are going to revert back to the immature leaves, which are the leaves that are completely solid without those fenestrations and perforations in it. So I have a video here, I'll pop in the link above. What I did was that with my Monstera, I cut all the leaves, I cut the actual plant in half as well, and this very intense harsh pruning, the initial leaves reverted back to the immature leaves. So Monsteras do like pruning, but don't go too far. So I would suggest that if you want those mature leaves with the fenestrations in it, then only prune the leaves that are required. So the leaves that have gone yellow, that have gone brown, the ones that are still solid green, I would leave it, even if it's an immature leaf that has no fenestrations in it. If it's still green, I don't think there's any point to actually pruning those leaves off, because the plant is still using those leaves to capture the sunlight and photosynthesize new energy for the plant to use. Now, some gardeners say that with these immature leaves, it's best to cut them off if you want the mature leaves. To be honest, I haven't found that. I found that it didn't really make a difference if I cut it off or not, and I just think that it's probably better just to leave it if it's still green, because the plant is still using it. If the plant wasn't using those immature leaves to actually grow, then the plant would have actually withdrawn all the nutrients out of the leaves, and that's why older leaves start to go brown and yellow, because the plant has no use for that leaf anymore. The next tip I have is that when you're actually growing your Monstera, Monsteras can grow very fast and it needs nutrients. So don't deprive of your Monstera with depriving it from nutrients. So you need to fertilize the Monstera. So I tend to fertilize my Monstera once every month if it's growing. So I don't fertilize it each watering time. I used to do that, but I found that that was too much and I ended up over-fertilizing my Monstera. So I found that I fertilize it once a month in the growing season. And I also reduce the concentration down, so I don't give the full dose. So I would recommend you use any sort of well-balanced fertilizer. I happen to use Focus Foliage Focus. And what I do is that with the recommendation, I halve the dosage. That way I don't end up over-fertilizing my Monstera. It's so important to clean the leaves. I get always surprised how much dirt and dust can collect on my Monstera leaves. So I tend to wipe my Monstera leaves once a month with a clean cloth. I tend to just use water, or sometimes I'll use a baby wipe. And it's so important to clean the Monstera leaves, because if there's a layer of dirt or dust on the leaves are not going to work to its optimal peak. So it's going to not be able to capture as much sunlight as possible, and that can hinder the growth of those mature leaves and reduce the production of those fenestrations and perforations on the leaves. Also, my final tip, and thank you so much for watching the video to the end, is that Monsteras, if you want those big mature leaves, it depends on how mature the Monstera is in the first place. If you buy it at the nursery, if you find that the main stem of the Monstera is very thin, you know that Monstera is not as mature as a Monstera has a big fat plump stem. So if you're going to choose a Monstera from the nursery, choose the one that has the thickest stem possible, because that's most likely that Monstera is the most mature. So in the end, with the Monstera, because it was produced those fenestrations and perforations, the more the mature the Monstera is, you got to give it time for the Monstera to actually produce it as well. So it does involve a bit of patience. Now, if you want to know why your Monstera, the leaves are going brown, watch this video here, and I'll see you in the next video.